in rural California, and the stigma they faced, these men were engaged fathers, ceremony participants, and promoters of food sovereignty through subsistence living and deeply embedded members of the community. Though they struggled to find employment or manage their substance abuse issues, the men she interviewed exemplified the Yurok value of responsibility that Judge Abby centers in her work. The Yurok Court provides re-entry support to people like the men George interviewed, who are returning to their community after incarceration. The tribe manages 2 coming home houses and provides transportation assistance, as well as case managers and lawyers to help connect people to resources. They also provide free phone cards to every Yurok person who is currently incarcerated so they can maintain contact with their loved ones while in prison or jail. In California, it costs 2.5 cents per minute to make a phone call and 5 cents per message on their tablets. This may not sound like much, but incarcerated people in California earn between 8 cents and 95 cents an hour. Even a brief call to loved ones can eat up a significant amount of their wages. But support of currently and formerly incarcerated people is only the first step. We're working more and more with state courts to divert people out of their systems, Judge Abby says, because frankly, when they go there and come back, they have not addressed the issues that led them there. That's not okay. Nationally, formerly incarcerated people are 10 times more likely to be homeless than the general population, 5 times more likely to be unemployed, and often continue to struggle with substance abuse or mental health issues. Diverting people from the carceral system to the Yurok court system can help by reducing someone's sentence or eliminating it altogether. If they are able to address their issue in a meaningful way, it also ensures that formerly incarcerated people are treated with a kind of respect and care they often don't get in a state or federal legal system. Our best case scenario would be walking with Yurok values, George says. Incarceration would be option 10 after exhausting all our other options. There are many reasons that the Yurok court has been so successful, but the community's tight-knit nature is certainly a contributing factor. The network is so incredibly dense. Everybody knows everyone, and there are huge resources in that, George says. But when there is trauma in one network node, it reverberates more loudly because we are so connected. So trauma becomes an urgent issue for the entire community to help address, not an isolated individual failure, as arrest and incarceration are treated by the American legal perspective. Judge Abby takes pride in the court being a resource hub that's responsive to community needs. In addition to court services and reentry support, they provide a variety of community programs not typically seen in a court setting. They offer college preparation support, distribute Narcan, a nasal spray that can treat opioid overdose, and bring hot meals to community elders. Anyone can participate, and people can refer themselves to the programs. You don't get help in the other system unless you get caught doing something, Judge Abby says. Who does that? That's so bad for you. Let the human decide. Look, I made a mistake. I need help. The Yurok aren't alone in revitalizing traditional forms of justice. In Southern California, Quechuan tribal judge Claudette White pioneered the use of tribal values and customs in legal proceedings to reduce incarceration rates. She was highlighted in the 2017 documentary Tribal Justice alongside Judge Abby. The Navajo Nation Peacemaking Program, which prioritizes non-punitive dispute resolution and restorative justice, has been a parallel entity to the Western-style court for 4 decades. That they let it back in. It is the largest tribal justice system in the world after we destroyed it. These tribal communities demonstrate that we can implement alternatives to America's violent and racist carceral system, and these alternatives are urgently needed. Your way of doing things is not working, Judge Abby says, so you might want to look at how we managed to survive for a few thousand years. Abaki Beck is a writer and public health researcher. She co-manages a mutual aid fund for formerly incarcerated people and runs a social justice resource website. You can find her writing in Bitch Yes Magazine, Health Affairs, and other outlets. She is Blackfeet and Red River Metis. Okay. You know, we can do a quick little pause because we have that function now. And we're back. But for you, it is like I never left. Alright, so we shall move on to the next. It is 30 minutes long. Okay. Salt, Fat, Acid, and Heat by Samin, Nosrat. We are on how fat works. Which fats we use primarily affect flavor, but how we use them will determine texture, which is just as important in good cooking. Varied textures excite our palates. By transforming foods from soft and moist to crisp and crunchy, we introduce new textures and make the experience of eating more amusing, surprising, and delicious. Depending on how we use fats, we can achieve any one of 5 distinct textures in our food: crisp, creamy, flaky, tender, and light. Pan surfaces, a not entirely scientific magnification, which we will potentially use. So a non-stick or well-seasoned cast iron is flat, and a stainless steel is slightly little jagged, and an unseasoned cast iron is very largely big jagged. And those are those beautiful, fun illustrations. You're gonna have to get the book if you want to see more. Crisp. Oh my goodness. Humans love crisp and crunchy foods. According to chef Mario Batali, the word crispy sells more food than almost any other adjective. Crisp foods stoke our appetites by conjuring up past experiences of food with pleasing aromas, tastes, and sounds. This hoodie is very old, and I just lost the metal piece on this. I did not know. So glad you were there to witness that, finding out that piece is missing. My hoodie is broke. Life is grand. It's great, actually, legitimately. Because I'm living it. Okay. Just think of fried chicken, a version of which you'll encounter in practically any country around the world. Few moments in a meal can rival the first bite of chicken, fried so expertly that the skin shatters the moment your teeth sink into it. Steam ripe with the mouth-watering aromas of that crisp batter, a loud, attention-grabbing crunch, and the comforting flavors of fried chicken all emerge simultaneously to deliver that universal experience of deliciousness. For food to become crisp, the water trapped in its cells must evaporate. Water evaporates as it boils, so the surface temperature of the ingredient must climb beyond the boiling point of 212 degrees Fahrenheit, or 100 degrees Celsius. To achieve this effect on the entire surface of the food, it needs to be in direct, even contact with a heat source, such as a pan at temperature well beyond water's boiling point. But no food is perfectly smooth, and at microscopic level, most pans aren't either. In order to get even contact between the food and the pan, we need a medium: fat. Cooking fats can be heated at 350 degrees Fahrenheit and beyond before beginning to smoke, so they are ideal media for developing the crisp golden crusts that delight our palates so much. Cooking methods where fat is heated to achieve crispness include searing, sautéing, pan shallow, and deep frying. A bonus: using enough fat to create even surface contact will prevent food from sticking to the pan. As with salt, I encourage you to abandon any fear of fat, for knowing how to use fat properly may lead you to use less of it. The best way to know how much fat to use is to pay attention to certain sensory cues. Some ingredients, such as eggplant and mushrooms, act like sponges, quickly absorbing fat and then cooking dry against the hot metal. Using too little fat in a pan, or letting the fat be absorbed and neglecting to add more, will result in dark, bitter blisters on the surface of the food. Other ingredients, such as pork chops, or chicken thighs. I don't know why I paused like that. such as pork chops, pork chops, or chicken thighs, will release their own fat as they cook. Walk away from a pan of sizzling bacon for a few minutes, and you'll return to see the strips practically submerged in their own fat. Let your eyes, ears, and taste buds guide you in how much fat to use. Recipes can be a useful starting point, but conditions vary from kitchen to kitchen, depending on the tools available to you. Say a recipe asks you to cook 2 diced onions in 2 tablespoons of olive oil. In a small pan, that might be enough to coat the bottom, but in a larger pan with greater surface area, it probably isn't. Instead of just following a recipe, use your common sense too. For example, make sure that the bottom of the pan is coated with fat when sautéing, or that oil comes halfway up the sides of the food when shallow frying. Food cooking in too much fat is no more appetizing than its inverse. Few things can retroactively ruin a meal like a puddle of grease left on an otherwise empty plate. Drain fried foods, even pan or shallow fried foods, with a quick dab on a clean dish towel or paper napkin before serving. And lift sautéed foods out of the pan with a slotted spoon or tongs rather than tilting them out onto a plate to leave the excess fat behind. While you're cooking, if you notice you've used more fat than you intended, you can tip the excess out of the pan, taking care to wipe its outer edge where fat may have dripped to prevent a flare-up. Just do it carefully so you don't burn yourself. If the pan is too heavy or hot, then be smart. Take the food out and use tongs to place it on a plate, then tip some of the fat out. Replace the food and continue cooking. It's not worth a burn or a grease spill to avoid washing an extra dish. That's for me. I hate washing extra dishes. I will cook in the least amount of pots and pans and silverware that I can. I hate dishes. I just like effective cooking, and cooking is just efficient. That's what it is. I like efficiency, and so much of cooking is not efficient because it takes so much time for such a short amount. And the time aspect for me is just never the time and the work and the enjoyment. The enjoyment is real. I just don't want to do the dishes. Anyways. But it's not worth a burn or a grease spill to avoid washing an extra dish. Heating oil properly. Preheat the pan to reduce the amount of time fat spends in direct contact with the hot metal, minimizing opportunity for it to deteriorate. As oil is heated, it breaks down, leading to flavor degradation and the release of toxic chemicals. Food is also more likely to stick to a cold pan, another reason to preheat. But exceptions to the preheating rule exist. Butter and garlic. Both will burn if the pan is too hot, so you must heat them gently. In all other cooking, preheat the pan and then add the fat, letting it heat up before adding any other ingredients. The pan should be hot enough so that oil immediately ripples and shimmers when added. Various metals conduct heat at different rates, so there's no set amount of time to recommend. Instead, test the pan with a drop of water. If it crackles a little before evaporating, it doesn't have to be a violent sound, then the pan is ready. A general clue that both the pan and fat are hot enough is the sound of a delicate sizzle upon addition of the food. If you add food too early and don't get that sizzle, just take the food out, let the pan heat up sufficiently, and put it back in to ensure it doesn't stick or overcook before it browns. Alright. I don't want to take up too much time, so we're going to read from The Ultimate Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy by Douglas Adams. We are reading from the book Radio Broadcast. I'm not sure it's written down for me. The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Because once we finish that, we'll be reading The Restaurant at the End of the Universe. Exciting. We left off with the improbability drive And Arthur looked up. "Ford," he said, "there's an infinite number of monkeys outside who want to talk to us about the script for Hamlet they've worked out." Chapter 10. The infinite improbability drive is a wonderful new method of crossing vast interstellar distances in a mere nothingth of a second, without all that tedious mucking about in hyperspace. It was discovered by a lucky chance, and then developed into a governable form of propulsion by the Galactic Government's research team on Damagron. This, briefly, is the story of its discovery. The principle of generating small amounts of finite improbability by simply hooking the logic circuits of a Bambleweenie 57 sub-meson brain to an atomic vector plotter suspended by a strong Brownian motion producer, say a nice hot cup of tea, were of course well understood, and such generators were often used to break the ice at parties by making all the molecules in the hostess's undergarments leap simultaneously 1 foot to the left, in accordance with the theory of indeterminacy. Why is everyone so obsessed with women's panties? They're literally visible, like, they're everywhere. Everyone wears underwear. Everyone wears panties. Unless you don't, and you go commando, and that's dope too. I've had phases. Life's great. Wear what you're comfortable with. Clothes are clothes. They go on your body. Many respectable physicists said that they weren't going to stand for this, partly because it was a debasement of science, but mostly because they didn't get invited to those sorts of parties. Another thing they couldn't stand was the perpetual failure that they encountered in trying to construct a machine which could generate the infinite improbability field needed to flip a spaceship across the mind-paralyzing distances between the farthest stars. And in the end, they grumpily announced that such a machine was virtually impossible. Then one day, a student who had been left to sweep up the lab after a particularly unsuccessful party found himself reasoning this way. If, he thought to himself, such a machine is a virtual impossibility, then it must logically be a finite improbability. So all I have to do in order to make one is to work out exactly how improbable it is, feed that figure into the finite improbability generator, give it a fresh cup of really hot tea, and turn it on. He did this, and was rather startled to discover that he had managed to create the long-sought-after golden infinite improbability generator out of thin air. It startled him even more when, just after he was awarded the Galactic Institute's Prize for Extreme Cleverness, he got lynched by a rampaging mob of respectable physicists who had finally realized that the one thing they really couldn't stand was a smartass. Chapter 11. The improbability-proof control cabin of the Heart of Gold looked like a perfectly conventional spaceship, except that it was perfectly clean because it was so new. Some of the control seats hadn't had the plastic wrapping taken off yet. The cabin was mostly white, oblong, and about the size of a smallish restaurant. In fact, it wasn't perfectly oblong. The two long walls were raked round in a slight parallel curve, and all the angles and corners of the cabin were contoured in excitingly chunky shapes. The truth of the matter is that it would have been a great deal simpler and more practical to build the cabin as an ordinarily three-dimensional oblong room, but then the designers would have got miserable. As it was, the cabin looked excitingly purposeful, with large video screens ranged over the control and guidance system panels on the concave wall, and long banks of computers set into the convex wall. In one corner, a robot sat humped, its gleaming brushed steel head hanging loosely between its gleaming brushed steel knees. It too was fairly new, but though it was beautifully constructed and polished, it somehow looked as if the various parts of its more or less humanoid body didn't quite fit properly. In fact, they fitted perfectly well, but something in its bearing suggested that they might have fitted better. Zaphod Beeblebrox paced nervously up and down the cabin, brushing his hands over pieces of gleaming equipment and giggling with excitement. Trillian sat hunched over a clump of instruments reading off figures. Her voice was carried around the tannoy system of the whole ship. 5-1 against and falling, she said. 4-1 against and falling. 3-1. 2. 1. Probability factor of 1-1. We have normality. I repeat, we have normality. She turned her microphone off, then turned it back on, with a slight smile, and continued, Anything you still can't cope with is therefore your own problem. Please relax. You will be sent for soon. Zaphod burst out in annoyance. Who are they, Trillian? Trillian spun her seat around to face him and shrugged. Just a couple of guys we seem to have picked up in open space. Section double Z, plural Z alpha. Yes, well, that's a very sweet thought, Trillian, complained Zaphod. But do you really think it's wise under the circumstances? I mean, here we are on the run and everything. We must have the police and half the galaxy after us by now. And we stopped to pick up hitchhikers. Okay, so 10 out of 10 for style, but minus several million for good thinking, yeah? He tapped irritably at a control panel. Trillian quietly moved his hand before he tapped anything important. Whatever Zaphod's qualities of mind might include, dash, bravado, conceit, he was mechanically inept, and could easily blow the ship up with an extravagant gesture. Trillian had come to suspect that the main reason he had such a wild and successful life was that he never really understood the significance of anything he did. Zaphod, she said patiently, they were floating unprotected in open space. You wouldn't want them to have died, would you? Well, no. Not as such, not die as such. But? Trillian cocked her head on one side. Well, maybe someone else might have picked them up later. A second later and they would have been dead. Yeah, so if you'd taken the trouble to think about the problem a bit longer, it would have gone away. You'd have been happy to let them die? Well, not happy as such, but anyway, said Trillian, turning back to the controls, I didn't pick them up. What do you mean? Who picked them up then? The ship did. Huh? The ship did. All by itself. Huh? While you were in improbability drive. While we were in improbability drive. But that's incredible. No, Zaphod, just very, very improbable. Yeah. Look, Zaphod, she said, patting his arm, don't worry about the aliens. They're just a couple of guys, I expect. I'll send the robot down to get them and bring them up here. Hey, Marvin. In the corner, the robot's head swung up sharply, but then wobbled almost imperceptibly. It pulled itself up to its feet as if it were about 5 pounds heavier than it actually was, and made what an outside observer would have thought was a heroic effort to cross the room. It stopped in front of Trillian and seemed to stare through her left shoulder. I think you ought to know I'm feeling very depressed, it said. Its voice was low and hopeless. Oh, God, muttered Zaphod and slumped into a seat. Well, said Trillian in a bright, compassionate tone, here's something to occupy you and keep your mind off things. It won't work, droned Marvin. I have an exceptionally large mind. Exceptionally large mind. Marvin, warned Trillian. All right, said Marvin. What do you want me to do? Go down to number 2 entry bay and bring the 2 aliens up here under surveillance. With a microsecond pause and a finely calculated micromodulation of pitch and timbre, nothing you could actually take offense at, Marvin managed to convey his utter contempt and horror of all things human. Just that? He said. Yes, said Trillian firmly. I won't enjoy it, said Marvin. Zaphod leaped out of his seat. She's not asking you to enjoy it, he said. Just do it, will you? All right, said Marvin, like the tolling of a great cracked bell. I'll do it. Good, snapped Zaphod. Great, thank you. Marvin turned and lifted his flat-topped triangular red eyes up toward him. I'm not getting you down at all,